On the morning of February 14, 1985, a 22-year-old woman in Arlington, Texas baked a heart-shaped cake for the man she was going to marry. He was flying home that evening from a business trip. She had flour on her hands and a $5,000 engagement ring on her finger, and she was counting down the hours until she could give it to him. By the time he landed, she was dead. Her ring was gone. The man who took it left something of his own behind in that apartment. It sat sealed in an evidence storage room for nearly 40 years. And when science finally caught up to what he left behind, it didn't lead investigators to a living suspect. It led them to a grave. This is the story of Terry McAdams. And the monster who was already dead before anyone knew his name. Terry McAdams was 22 years old, the oldest of 3 sisters, born and raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. Karen and Pamela were the younger 2, and to them, Terry was the big sister every kid dreams of having. She taught them how to drive. As a teenager she drove a convertible with an 8-track player, which made her the most popular person on any night out. They'd ride for hours, windows down, belting out every song. She was feisty, her sister said. Fun. The kind of person who walked into a room and changed the temperature of it. Terry started college at the University of Arkansas, where she met her fiancé. When he landed a job in Arlington, Texas, she followed him and transferred to the University of Texas at Arlington to finish her degree. The two of them built a life together in a ground-floor apartment at the Walnut Ridge Apartments on Walnut Hill Circle, the kind of place a young couple moves into when the future finally starts to feel real. By February of 1985, Terry was planning a wedding and talking to her mother and back in Little Rock almost every day. She was doing what a 22-year-old does when the pieces are coming together. She was happy. She was safe. Or at least, she believed she was. But something had been wrong in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex since late 1984. Something that was getting worse. Catherine Davis, a 23-year-old aspiring model, had vanished in September. Marilyn Hartman, a 29-year-old middle school teacher, was found strangled in her bedroom in October. 3 days after that, Cindy Heller, 23 years old, a TCU graduate, was found strangled in a creek bed on the university campus. In November, another teacher, Katherine Jackson, was found strangled in her bathtub with the water still running. By December of 1984, 8 women were missing or dead across the Metroplex. The Fort Worth Police Department formed a homicide task force. Agencies across the region joined the effort. The news covered it relentlessly, and the coverage landed the way it was always going to land, like a stone dropped into still water, spreading fear outward in every direction. Women across the area changed the way they lived. Parents called their daughters every night. Roommates checked on each other before bed. The whole region moved through its days with a low-grade terror that never fully lifted. For young women living alone or with boyfriends who traveled for work, it felt suffocating. Terry felt it more than most. Her mother told reporters that Terry called home sometimes more than once a day during those months. She was terrified, and said, "All the girls who disappeared or were killed were about her age, young, pretty girls. So naturally, being that far from home in a strange town, with something like that going on, you would be afraid." Terry quit her job in Irving so she wouldn't have to drive home after dark. When her fiancé was out of town on business, she became reclusive. She stopped going out at night, not even for groceries. She locked the doors. She locked the windows. She stayed inside and called her mother and her sisters and waited for the sun to come back up. She changed her routines, gave up her income, and shrank her entire world down to the size of an apartment that felt safe. She took every precaution she thought necessary. It didn't matter. The man who killed Terry McAdams didn't find her on a dark road or a parking lot or at a job she drove to after sunset. He came through the door of her own bedroom inside the very apartment she had turned into the safest place she knew. On Thursday, February 14, 1985, Terry's fiancé was out of town on a business trip. He was scheduled to fly back to Arlington that evening, and Terry was supposed to pick him up at the airport. She spent the afternoon baking him a heart-shaped cake. A Valentine's Day cake, for the man she was going to spend her life with. That evening, she got on the phone with her sister. They talked for a while the way sisters do, easy and unhurried. It was the last conversation anyone ever had with Terry McAdams. Sometime after she hung up the phone, a man broke into the apartment through a sliding glass door connected to the bedroom. He sexually assaulted her. He beat her to death with blunt force. And then he took the engagement ring off her finger, the ring she had been wearing all afternoon while she baked that cake. A maintenance worker at the Walnut Ridge Apartments discovered her body the following morning when he entered the unit to check on a reported issue. He was not prepared for what he found. Arlington police arrived and processed the scene with methodical care. They collected biological evidence, dusted for prints, and documented a distinctive boot print pressed into the dirt outside the point of entry. They photographed the broken sliding glass door, the interior of the bedroom, and the position of the body. They did everything right. The scene told them what had happened. It did not tell them who had done it. Nearly 40 years later, Detective Devin Coffer would say that the officers who worked the case in 1985 were very thorough and collected a lot of physical evidence that would later prove to be vital. That evidence sealed carefully into storage on a February morning in 1985 is the only reason this case was ever solved. Those detectives had no way of knowing what they were actually preserving. They just knew to preserve everything. That instinct saved this case. Terry's fiancé was eliminated as a suspect almost immediately. He had documented business travel out of state. He flew home expecting to see her at the airport and walked into a crime scene instead. Investigators turned their attention outward. They canvassed the Walnut Ridge Apartments and every surrounding block, knocking on every door in the complex. They ran the boot print found outside the bedroom through their records. They questioned dozens of residents. They pulled criminal histories on anyone in the Arlington area with a record of violence against women, and ran background checks on every name that surfaced through tips and door-to-door interviews. One name stood out from the rest. A man who lived near the complex. 30 years old. A registered sex offender with a criminal history that included sexual assault against at least 2 other victims. Detectives went through his background, verified what they could, and checked his alibi. The boot print outside Terry's bedroom matched his shoe size, but matching a shoe size was not the same as placing a man at a crime scene. Dozens of men in Arlington wore the same size boot. And in 1985, there was no DNA testing. No CODIs. No national DNA database. No investigative genetic genealogy. The biological evidence sitting in that evidence room could have tied this man to that apartment beyond any doubt. But the technology to read it did not yet exist. Without DNA, the strongest physical evidence detectives had was a shoe size and a nearby address. The man was questioned. He was released. The investigation pressed forward. More names came in. More interviews. More dead ends. Detectives canvassed the complex a second time, expanded their search radius into neighboring communities, worked the phones, and chased down every tip that came through. They also checked whether Terry's case connected to the strangling murders that the Fort Worth task force was investigating across the Metroplex. It didn't fit cleanly. The Fort Worth cases all involved strangulation. Terry had been beaten to death. Different method. Different signature. Arlington investigators treated her case separately and kept working it on its own terms. By the end of 1985, the McAdams homicide was an open case with no viable suspects and no clear path forward. The file was shelved. The detectives who had worked the case moved on to other assignments. Some of them retired years later without ever knowing whether the murder of Terry McAdams would ever be solved. Back in Little Rock, the McAdams family waited for a phone call that never came. Karen had been a kid when her big sister was killed. After February 14, 1985, she carried Terry's case the way families of unsolved homicide victims always carry things quietly, constantly, beneath everything else. She called the detective's office year after year, asking if there was anything new. The answer was always the same. She learned to live with the not knowing, the way you learn to live with a low-grade ache that never fully goes away. She grew up, built a life, and the question of who killed her sister sat underneath all of it like something buried. She married and became Karen Hopper. Her husband Brad became part of a family that carried this. Pamela married and became Pamela McGinnis. Their mother Ann had listened to Terry's frightened phone calls from Little Rock in the weeks before the murder. She had heard her daughter's voice shaking with fear. She knew how hard Terry had tried to keep herself safe. And passed away without ever learning who had come through that sliding glass door. Their father died without knowing too. Terry's stepmother, Carol Ann McAdams, stayed connected to the sisters and to the case through every one of those long years. She was still there in 2024 when the answer finally came. After so many long years, Karen said at the press conference, we had come to accept that we would probably never know who murdered our sister. She had spent more years carrying her sister's case than Terry had been alive. Homicide detectives at the Arlington Police Department revisited the case multiple times across the following decades, sending evidence to labs and checking expanding databases as new forensic technologies became available. Each time, they hit the same wall. The physical evidence was there. The technology to match it to a specific person was not. In 1998, the FBI launched CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database that allowed crime scene DNA profiles to be run against millions of convicted offenders across the country. For cold cases with biological evidence sitting in storage, it was a genuine breakthrough. Investigators submitted the evidence from Terry's case into the system. No match came back. The man who killed her was not in the database. Then, in 2021, Arlington police sent multiple pieces of physical evidence from the case to a forensic laboratory for the most advanced DNA testing then available. A full genetic profile for an unknown male suspect was successfully developed. That profile was entered into CODIS. Still no match. The man who killed Terry McAdams had never provided a DNA sample to any law enforcement agency in his life. Every system designed to find him came up empty. He was invisible to all of it. But the detectives were not done. In August of 2023, the Arlington Police Department reached out to the FBI's investigative genetic genealogy team at the Dallas field office to ask whether the McAdams case qualified for a new kind of analysis. In January of 2024, the case was formally assigned to APD homicide detective Devin Coffer. Investigative genetic genealogy works on a fundamentally different principle than CODIS. Rather than matching crime scene DNA against a database of convicted offenders, it uploads the genetic profile to public ancestry platforms and searches for biological relatives of the unknown person. If a cousin or a second cousin has submitted their own DNA to a genealogy website, the system finds the family connection. From there, investigators work backward through public records, births, deaths, marriages, addresses, constructing a family tree until they identify the specific person who left evidence at the crime scene. Since 2018, the technique had cracked hundreds of cold cases across the country, identifying killers who had spent decades believing they were untouchable. And it worked here too. The genealogy research pointed to a name. But there was a problem that most investigative genetic genealogy cases don't encounter. The man at the center of that family tree was dead. He had been dead since 1985. His DNA had never been collected by any law enforcement agency while he was alive. There were no samples in any database anywhere in the country. Investigators could not confirm the match without a direct genetic comparison, and the man they needed to compare against was in a grave. So the FBI went looking for a living relative. Someone who shared enough genetic material with the dead man to serve as a biological reference point. They found one, an out-of-state relative, genetically close enough to make a meaningful comparison. FBI agents traveled to meet with the person in person. They explained the investigation, laid out what they needed, and asked not demanded for a voluntary DNA sample. The relative agreed. Without that moment of cooperation, one private person's willingness to help identify a killer they had never heard of, the identification would have stopped right there. 39 years of investigation, decades of preserved evidence, months of genealogical research, and it all came down to one person saying yes. The sample was sent to the Center for Human Identification at the University of North Texas Health Science Center in Fort Worth, one of the leading forensic DNA laboratories in the country, specializing in connecting genetic material to specific individuals through advanced analysis. The lab ran the comparison between the relative's DNA and the crime scene evidence that had been sealed away in an Arlington storage room in February of 1985. It matched. His name was Bernard Sharp. Sharp was 30 years old in 1985. He lived in a neighborhood near the Walnut Ridge Apartments just minutes from where Terry was killed. He was a registered sex offender with a criminal history that included sexual assault against at least 2 other victims and a documented record of violence against women. His shoe size matched the boot print pressed into the dirt outside that bedroom door. His proximity matched everything investigators had suspected from the beginning. He was the man Arlington police had questioned in the weeks immediately following Terry's murder. They had brought him in, run his background, looked at every angle they had access to, and couldn't hold him. The DNA that would have placed him definitively inside that apartment was sitting in an evidence storage room at the exact same time he was sitting across from detectives, answering their questions. They had no choice but to let him go. Bernard Sharp and Terry McAdams had never met. Police believe the attack was completely random. He chose that apartment, found a way in through the glass door, and killed a woman he had never laid eyes on before that night. A woman who had spent weeks being terrified of exactly the kind of man he had always been. 9 months after he murdered Terry, on November 3, 1985, Bernard Sharp forced his way into a home in Arlington where his estranged wife Denise, 29 years old, was staying with her best friend Deborah De La Torre, who was 25, and a cousin. He was armed. He shot Denise. He shot Deborah. He critically wounded the cousin. Then he turned the gun on himself. The cousin, bleeding badly, managed to stumble to a neighbor's house and bang on the door. She just said Bernard had gone berserk and shot everybody, the neighbor later told the Star-Telegram. 3 people were dead, including Sharp. 1 was critically wounded. The November shooting was filed as a domestic murder-suicide, a clear perpetrator, already dead. The McAdams case was filed separately as an unsolved stranger homicide with no confirmed suspect. Different categories. Different detectives. Different parts of the building. Nobody had any reason to look for a thread connecting a stranger rape and murder in February to a domestic shooting in November. The common link was a dead man whose name had appeared on an interview list 9 months before he killed himself. Bernard Sharp had been in a grave for 39 years by the time the DNA confirmed it was him. Detective Devin Coffer received the call from the lab confirming the match. He said later that getting that call meant everything in the world to him. On August 14, 2024, the Arlington Police Department and the FBI's Dallas Field Office held a joint press conference. Arlington Police Chief Al Jones stood at the podium and named Bernard Sharp as the man who murdered Terry McAdams 39 years earlier. FBI Special Agent in Charge Chad Yarbrough described investigative genetic genealogy as one of the most valuable tools available to law enforcement today. Detective Coffer credited the original investigators from 1985 their careful, thorough evidence collection, every sealed bag and documented photograph as the foundation that made everything that followed possible. Then the family spoke. Karen Hopper stood in front of the cameras. 39 years after her big sister was murdered on Valentine's Day, she told the room who Terry was. Amazing, she said. Beautiful and full of life. Feisty and fun. The kind of person who once spotted Princess Diana while out dancing in Europe, walked straight up to her, and asked if she wanted to dance. Diana said she couldn't just then, but they talked. That was Terry. Bold. Warm. Impossible to forget. To know her was to love her, Karen said. As I stand here today, I know that she and my mom and dad are smiling down on this miraculous moment. Also standing at that podium, Pamela McInnes, Karen's younger sister. Brad Hopper, Karen's husband, who had spent years as part of a family that carried an open wound. And Carol Ann McAdams, the stepmother who had stayed connected through every decade of silence and lived long enough to finally hear a name. There was no arrest that day. There would be no trial. No sentencing. No courtroom. The man who killed Terry McAdams had been lying in a grave since November of 1985. The only thing the announcement could give the family was the truth. And after 39 years, the truth was enough to stand in front of a room full of cameras and say out loud. Chief Jones said it would have been easy, over the years, to lose faith. To accept that this case would never be solved. But the detectives never wavered, he said. And neither did this family. Terry McAdams was 22 years old. She started college at the University of Arkansas, fell in love, transferred to UT Arlington to be with the man she was going to marry, and was building a life in a city she was still learning. She had 3 sisters, a mother who answered every frightened phone call, and a fiancé flying home to her on Valentine's Day. She baked him a heart-shaped cake that afternoon. She never got to give it to him. If you want to see more solved cold cases, check out the playlist linked below. Every case on this channel is one that somebody refused to let go of. That refusal matters. It always has.